Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm your host, Sher Ali Khan. Today I'm joined by Banu Bargu, professor of history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a political theorist whose work has been indispensable for thinking about the body, suffering, resistance, and the limits of dominant political forms. Her books include Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons, and Disembodiment, Corporeal Politics of Radical Refusal. In this conversation, we'll be discussing how acts of self-destruction, self-starvation, and bodily suffering compel us to rethink agency, dignity, refusal, and the political forms through which such acts are usually misunderstood or dismissed. Banu, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. I wanted to begin with your intellectual trajectory. Looking back from Starve and Immolate to Disembodiment, how did the question of bodily self-endangerment become central to your thinking about political agency and resistance? What pushed you from the earlier language of the weaponization of life toward the problem of disembodiment?
Thank you. Starve and Immolate started as my doctoral dissertation project. And at that time, I was really interested in the idea of sacrifice and the relationship between sacrifice and sovereignty. And I was deeply affected by a struggle that unfolded at the time that I was a graduate student in Turkey's prisons. There were a lot of political prisoners in Turkey's prisons. Turkey had a very militant left tradition stemming from the 70s going into the 80s and 90s. And at the turn of 2000, they began a collective hunger strike that turned into a fast unto death that incorporated a lot of different factions of the radical left, of the extra-parliamentary left, and really became a big, big struggle. But it also presented some really difficult questions. For example, is this the form of struggle that the left should pursue, hunger strike or fasting unto death? Given prisons as its point of emergence, of course, that was understandable to a degree, but it did raise a lot of theoretical questions about the role of the body in struggle, the organized act of self-inflicted violence, and the kinds of goals that it could achieve. And then the kind of discrepancy between the goals that it wanted to achieve and the existential register in which it was couching the struggle. Of course, the state's response was extreme, and there was a big prison operation in which the state security forces captured the prisons from coming in from the outside and dispersed the protesters into the newly built high security prisons. So it was, on the one hand, a very specific struggle that marked an incredibly important moment on the Turkish left. But at the same time, for me, it raised big questions about the meaning of sacrifice, the meaning of the body in political struggle, and the role of prisons as an archive of democracy, both democratic practices in prison, but a kind of counterpoint to the self-representation of polities that consider themselves democratic, as an archive of oppressive practices that kind of contradict that narrative. So that was the starting point of my first book. When I finished my first book, I realized, and that was around the time that Mohamed Bouazizi committed an act of self-incineration, which in a metaphorical sense set North Africa on fire and is alleged to have led to the uprisings that characterized the early 2010s and whose reverberations in a certain way in the region we are still living with today. And what I realized when I was thinking through Bouazizi's act, because it's still, in a sense, continuous with the idea of relying on one's body to make a political point, I saw a lot of continuities between my first project. Sorry, my light just my first project and what I was seeing. But then there were also a lot of differences in the sense that in the first project, when I was looking at Turkey's prisons, I saw a lot of organized militancy. When I looked at Bouazizi's case specifically, it was, a person who had no particular political ties, not a kind of militant background, no deep links of solidarity with social movements. And so that made me wonder and want to think more rigorously about how often and how pervasive might be these individualized acts of self-incineration, self-starvation, other forms of self-directed violence, and what they might mean politically in the absence of a kind of determined confrontation between an organized militant movement and, let's say, the state. So I started looking, and to my surprise, these acts were everywhere and so frequent, so pervasive. I mean, once you start uncovering that reality, it becomes unavoidable to notice the extent to which they happen. So I thought I have to really rethink my vocabulary. I have to rethink the questions that I'm asking and to understand how to theorize these acts that are happening in a lot of places, especially in the global south. And
Yeah.
that was the transition to the second book project, which culminated in Disembodiment.
That is quite interesting. And in disembodiment, you begin with acts of self-destruction and bodily self-endangerment as a problem of political theory. What led you to take these acts seriously as a phenomena worthy of contemplation rather than treat them as marginal to politics?
That's a great question. I mean, what I experienced in some ways was a frustration with available scholarly apparatuses of analyzing these acts. I mean, when one surveys the literature, there are two dominant disciplines that approach these acts. One is psychology, psychiatry, psychiatric medicine, let's say, and the other one is sociology. It's kind of the Durkheimian approach. And of course, it's modern, contemporary followers. And they are on two different ends, in a way, of the spectrum, in the sense that one really looks at individual cases and tries to understand the kinds of problems that are experienced psychologically that might lead somebody to carry out something like that. On the other hand, the sociological approach looks more at social dynamics, structural dynamics that over time lead to the increases and decreases in the rates of self-destruction. But what was similar to me, despite the fact that they look at it from different angles, is that they create this theoretical object called suicide or suicidal action. And because not all of those actions end up in death. And that then becomes the main framing by which one can approach these acts. So I thought, in some ways, this theoretical object makes certain phenomena visible. We put numbers to it. We have a statistical analysis of it. We try to understand, the psychological causes that might push somebody over the edge, let's say. At the same time, it constructs this theoretical object called suicide in a way that forecloses a lot of other questions. And so my was to basically try to go against the hegemony of these disciplines in the scholarly field by drawing on critical traditions of thinking, critical traditions of theory, to see if I can problematize the framing of these approaches and to bring alternative questions to the table such that different answers could be generated. And I wanted to get at the question of the political nature of these actions. And I didn't feel like I could really do that by what was available, either in sociology or in psychology, and that I had to really draw on critical traditions, and not just one tradition, but a host of critical traditions because each has strengths and weaknesses. They complement and diverge from one another in different ways. So I was looking at phenomenology, anti-colonial theory, Marxism, Foucault, and like a various different thinkers that help us ask questions in different ways in order to get a sense of what I wanted to eventually move toward, which was the recognition of the politicality in these acts, in bodily agency, and the implications of that.
Early in the you ask in relation to Bouazizi and the many figures who echo across the introduction, how we see and name actions that bring death or injury to the very person performing them, and whether such acts belong to the margins of the political or command an inherent politicality, I guess you could say. How did those questions push you away from the dominant vocabulary through which self-directed violence is usually interpreted?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I wanted to understand what different forms of self directed violence had in common with one another than what they had that was different. When you look at that field from the lens of, say, suicide, it's like you separate those acts that ended up in the actor's death from all other forms of action, such as bodily injury or radical self-endangerment. There's a thick line that you draw between those forms of action. And for me, there was something about the intensified use of the body, intensified reliance on the body, and the kind of blurring of, intentionality where you are you are doing something, but at the same time there is an excess of your body in that action that in a sense overtakes any kind of rational or instrumental account of what you are doing to your body or with your body. So I wanted to capture that corporeality, that visceral dimension, and to put these forms of action on a kind of continuum, as it were, rather than, distinctive sets that had very little to do with one another. And in order to do that, I had to shift the register on which I was looking at these acts, not in terms of like what the actor wanted to do, intended to achieve, and did or did not achieve, but rather what kind of reliance on the body can we see here? How does that trouble questions of intentionality, the binary between what is reflective, what is pre-reflective, what is instrumental, what is non-instrumental? So those were like the limit forms of bodily action was like what I was really interested in, and the thread that I pursued. And that's how I ended up with the concept of disembodiment, which really, instead of something like suicide or self-immolation or self-starvation, focuses on the body as a common repertoire and the disembodiment or the forfeiture of the body, forfeiture of the self through the body to indicate a whole range of actions that in fact come under the rubric of that term as I try to conceptualize it in the book. And even though I started from actions that were focused on self-directed violence, I ended up opening up that category to a lot of different forms of bodily agency, including mass fainting episodes, spirit possession. I mean, these are the ways in which they appear in other discourses like anthropology, for example, to look at ways in which the body erupts, so to speak, whether or not the agents may want it or plan it. So laughing and crying and vertigo, like these forms of bodily reaction to certain crisis situations too, I included as forms of bodily agency that need to be taken into account when one is looking at the whole realm of actions that one performs.
Thank you for that. I wanted to speak a little bit about Mohamed uh, Bouazizi. He's such a important figure in the book. Uh, What did his self-immolation make visible for you about humiliation, block political life, and critique? And why did his act become such a crucial point of departure?
Thank you. Indeed, it's a very important, excuse me, it's a very important point of departure for the book. I mean, one reason is, as I've stated, the distinction between organized movements on one hand and individuals faced with oppression on the other hand. And for me, he really symbolizes, in a sense, the solitude of the individual who is faced with structures of oppression. So if he speaks for many more people than one can imagine. And so that was an important point. But what also really grasped me in his act is this intervention that for me is a kind of absolute refusal that arises from an assertion of dignity that refuses oppression, that refuses humiliation, that refuses to accept as a kind of fate the conditions that are imposed upon large sections of the world's population, whether it is in terms of poverty, precarity, disempowerment, dispossession. And so it is a point at which, it's a very simple no. And that's very powerful. And that is powerful because it really reminds one that, you know, people cannot be reduced to nothing. People
Yeah.
cannot be reduced to undignified lives and be expected to just suffer through it. I mean, people have a large degree of tolerance, that's for sure. But,
Mhm.
there comes a point where they refuse. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that the importance of that and to build from that. And dignity is very, very important to me as a category, especially because I want to really expand the meaning of what dignity means. And I do that in the book by arguing against some of the very influential interpreters in the Kantian tradition of human dignity, but who mainly interpret this as a kind of moral recognition, of moral respect, of the right to be free from moral injury or disrespect. And that is, of course, extremely important, but it is also reductive. I want to see dignity as an embodied sensibility, that it
Mhm.
has to attend to not just whether we are respected as persons, but whether we have the material conditions that allow us to live a dignified life, a humane life,
Yeah.
however you may want to define that. And how you define it, of course, is a function of cultural expectations, but also political struggle. So we can go into that. But I try to interpret dignity in a very broad material sense as well as a moral sense. And
Mhm.
therefore, you can't really just pretend to respect people as equal persons if they do not have the material conditions to fulfill a dignified life, if they are hungry, if they can't get a proper education, if they don't have access to healthcare, if they don't have access to welfare, if they cannot age with dignity, and all of the other things that come into one's life. So I'm very influenced by Ernst Bloch, who articulates a much more capacious sense of dignity when he has this metaphor of orthopedia of upright walking. And, really like the ability to stand upright is something that has to be both moral and material. And therefore, to go back to Bouazizi, I saw in his action this reclamation, this assertion of dignity that I think is really, really important through the refusal that he enacted at the cost of his life. And I think he stands for many.
And I think that dignity seems to be one of the crucial threads running through the book, especially where the oppressed turn to the body when every other avenue of political recognition has been blocked. And I wanted to stay with that chapter on Mohamed Bouazizi in the sense that you put him in conversation with Nazim Hikmat's "Why Did Banerjee Kill Himself?" What did that juxtaposition allow you to see about the political meaning of self-destruction across different historical conjunctures?
Yeah, great. Sorry. Nazım Hikmet is a big treasure, one of Turkey's most important poets, a real giant in world literature, and someone that I love deeply. And Nazım Hikmet's poem, Why Did Banerjee Kill Himself, was something that was a poem that was read by generations and generations of militants, definitely in Turkey, but I also suspect all over the world because he's one of the most translated Turkish poets. And the juxtaposition was interesting to me because there in that poem, Nazım Hikmet talks about the meaning of revolutionary sacrifice, the meaning of taking one's own life when one is part of a movement, when one is part of a movement that is on the up and up, so to speak. Of course, Hikmet was a communist and he finished his life in exile. He died in the Soviet Union. And he really, his thought, his philosophical thought, his political thought is shaped by a progressive view of history, a progressive philosophy of history, where eventually the success of the masses is inevitable, where eventually the masses will succeed in toppling oppression and achieve a more humane political order. So for him, the meaning of taking one's life when one is part of a movement that sooner or later will achieve victory, according to this progressive unfolding of history, is very different than the figure of Bouazizi, where not only is there not a comparable mass movement in context, nor is there really anymore a belief in the progressive unfolding of history. So, given these two major differences, even though it looks like we're looking at the same thing, an individual taking their own life, it has radically different meaning. So that juxtaposition was a way for me to raise these broader, say, metaphilosophical questions of the book. Like, what is the meaning of agency? And what is the meaning of, looking at history if there is no more a belief in the progressive unfolding of history towards freedom from oppression? And in the absence of those, we really have to reckon with the act in and of itself, without the political context, of a collective movement, and without the certitude that sooner or later victory is near, it's attainable. And that really was an attempt for me to focus on the differences between the two contexts, showing in a sense where the world was and where it has come to, and what we need to be confronting theoretically when we look at now a similar act that is superficially similar, as I said, but in fact may have very, very different meanings and implications in scope.
In that chapter, what was unique was, or what was special, or I'm looking for the word, but Bouazizi is no longer appears simply as a spontaneous victim of humiliation or as a martyr, but he's absorbed into a collective narrative, but as someone whose act forces a different understanding of political agency. What did it mean for you to read his self-incineration as a radical expression of refusal, or as an engaged withdrawal, or as you write, or a violent exit from the conditions that deny dignified life?
So there are two parts to your question. I'm going to try to divide them for a moment. The first part is this, that it is true that because the Tunisian masses were able to topple the regime soon after Bouazizi's self-incineration, there was a narrative that resembled very much the kind of progressive reading of history that Nazım Hikmet had when he was talking about Benerci, or the kind of progressive philosophy of history that a lot of progressive Marxist movements have had, or socialist movements have had throughout the 20th century. What I want to say is, yes, Bouazizi was unique in a sense in that way, but there are many more Bouazizis in the world whose acts they are similar, are comparable, but they don't make revolutions. They don't lead to revolutions. They don't necessarily topple government. They don't mobilize the masses. In fact, they barely make the news. And so, I mean, it's always a devastating loss for people near them, their friends and loved ones. But sometimes the broader world, the public, the global public, doesn't even register what has happened. And therefore, I wanted to, question this narrative of success that then retroactively, traces itself back to an act of self-incineration, to say it was like not in vain, it was not desperate, it was not for nothing. In fact, it had all these incredible consequences that led the masses to victory. It may happen, I don't deny that. But the point is, even if it doesn't happen, can we see something political in these acts? And especially, maybe to put the question slightly differently, not even if it doesn't happen, but especially when it doesn't happen, we now have to confront whether these acts are political acts of refusal in their own way, regardless of the consequences that they might generate, which is really independent of that in a certain way. So that's the first part of that question. And as for the second part, I think I would say, to bring the conversation back to the question of dignity and how this act of refusal, this act of withdrawal from the world, withdrawal from life, epitomizes a kind of radical engagement that is built on the assertion of an alternative life that is a dignified life. And in order to make the case that we shouldn't really judge from the consequences of the action, but from the acts themselves, I try to go back in history and to reconstruct precedents, a political history of these forms of action. So I look at the acts of, like, what I call death acts of the enslaved across the transatlantic passage and in the plantations upon first arrival in particular. And there are so many acts of self-destruction. I look at the suffragists, the women suffragists of Britain, early 20th century, their hunger strikes as a form of enactment of refusal. I look at Gandhi's fasting practices and the whole anti-colonial movement that is shaped around the centrality of the body in a certain way. And I position these as different modalities, but also precedents to say that there is, in fact, a kind of subterranean tradition in modernity that is full of these acts by the enslaved, by women, by the colonized, by the oppressed, who have resorted over and over and over to these forms of refusal, and not all of them have led to revolutions. Not all of them have led to successful outcomes or have ignited the masses. But if we can recognize their inherent politicality, maybe we have to then rethink our narratives, which are very predominant on, the circles of continental theory, let's say critical theory, to look at the masses as kind of passive, obedient, conforming, the ideological state apparatus, theories of hegemony, like all different forms of social and political theory of the 20th century is one way or another trying to deal with the obedience and conformity of the masses, why they do not resist. And I'm saying, well, maybe there are ways in which they resist that we are not used to, we're not acclimated to see as resistance, as political interventions that we have to pay attention to, that really destabilize that narrative of compliance, conformity, obedience, uniformity, etc. So that was a little bit what I was trying to do there.
Absolutely. You describe this as part of a global subterranean or subversive history of modernity, one that is obscured when history is told through the achievements of the modern subject. What did it mean for you to excavate that counter history and to read these acts as belonging to an alternative lineage of the agency?
Well, I mean, it really meant that we need to rethink how we view a modernity, that modernity is not simply, the achievements of the rational, intentional, instrumental, self-interested subject of the West, but that there are different histories, subterranean histories that we really need to pay attention to if we want to get a full picture of what that modernity looks like. And for me there, Sylvia Wynter was really an influential thinker that I learned a great deal from. When she writes how Western man with capital M, overgeneralizes itself into the representation of the human throughout modernity. She traces two different modalities. I can get into the details, but the broad gesture of the argument is that this
Yeah.
overgeneralization, this overrepresentation of Western man as standing in for the human in general has led to disastrous symbolic consequences for those who fall out of that designation. And whether it's indigenous peoples, whether it's non-white peoples, peoples of the third world, the South. And so the point is, if we want to destabilize the category of the Western subject, of Western man, we have to look at what falls out of it and the kinds of subjects that fall out of that designation and their subversive practices. And in a certain
Yeah.
way, to understand the construction of Western man as a response to these radical practices of selfhood that challenge some of the foundational assumptions of what it means to be a Western subject, like rationality, self-interestedness, self-transparency, etc. So I try to look at these acts from these various peoples, the enslaved, the colonized, women, etc., who engaged in struggle, who are not just oppressed, but who are refusing, who are fighting back, pushing back in ways that may not be legible to the mainstream, but nonetheless, I think are there and extremely important to challenge the narrative of a Eurocentric modernity, basically, and to show all these radical currents that were there and that continue to this day in informing our understanding, if we care to look, of what it means to be a human. And so when Sylvia Wynter invokes different genres of being human, I take that very seriously and to think with that. So to try to understand these acts that may seem like pathological or crazy or irrational from a mainstream perspective, to see that not only that they are refusals, but also that they invoke alternative ways of being human and alternative ways of living human lives with dignity that, because they are not fulfilled, end up in a kind of self-destructive register for those very agents. So that was a little bit like the thinking that went into excavating those alternative traditions.
A crucial move that takes place in the book is your displacement of suicide through the concept of disembodiment. You draw this term from Kant, but reformulated on a materialist sort of register centering bodily agency. What did this conceptual shift make possible for you, especially in relation to the phenomenology of self-directed violence and the kinds of questions it allows us to ask.
Yeah, I really wanted to move away from the conceptual apparatus of suicide and suicidal behavior, to move toward um, a more capacious understanding of bodily agency that would incorporate not just self-destruction, but what Kant calls like partial suicide, which is self-injurious behavior, self-directed acts of violence that do not lead to the death of the agent, but create harm in a different way, whether it's psychic harm or bodily harm. And also to look at acts of radical self-endangerment, for example, the idea of, putting yourself in extreme danger as forms of behavior that had a certain continuity. So reworking Kant's concept of disembodiment on a more expanded register allowed me to capture what already is inherent in Kant between partial and total suicide. So instead of looking at actions as like failed suicide or self-injury as a radically different category, he sees it as partial suicide. Of course, he's extremely against it, and he thinks that it's like the worst thing any human can do against their own person. But forgetting the moral baggage of that and working with what he sees in terms of the phenomenological continuity, I try to rework that as a kind of basis for rethinking a whole range of actions on the basis of bodily agency. And then I really direct the conversation into a kind of phenomenological inquiry. And there, Plessner is very important for my thinking, because he has this book called Laughing and Crying, where he theorizes these acts, these very human, very universal forms of outbursts as the eruption of the body in response to crisis situations. And for
Yeah.
me, it was incredibly eye-opening to, think about how we all are faced with situations where language fails us, rationality fails us. It's so overwhelming that the only response available really is, these outbursts of crying or laughing, his theory. But that shows something about the extremity of the crisis with which we are faced at that moment. And so I really built a lot of thinking around that to arrive at a concept of what I call corporeal critique. So what if we see these acts of the body, of the intervention of the body, as forms of critique that emerge when we are faced with crisis situations? It's kind of like the question that I reformulated from my original question of like, what do we make of self-immolation, let's say. And so from there, I tried to think with Fanon, with Plessner, with Marsa and Moss, who are thinkers of the body in different ways, and to put them in a kind of constellation to address and help me theorize bodily agency as such. So, hope that answers what you
Yeah,
have in mind.
absolutely. Yeah, and I feel that opens up onto another way of thinking about dignity, not simply as like a secular ground for prohibiting self-destruction, but as something that is, something that has a stake within these acts themselves. How does disembodiment and dignity reframe the political and theoretical meaning of bodily self-endangerment?
Thing I think that for me is clear from my study is that there is something about the body that refuses total domination. Theories of domination can have the tendency to give the sense that domination is easily totalizable. I want to say not so fast. I want to say this because I think the body says this. It says not so fast. There is a surplus, there is an excess of the body's agency that refuses any project of total domestication. And I really think that we will have a much more nuanced and enriched understanding of politics if we pay attention to that. First of all, I think it's important to understand, as I was saying a little while ago, to go against the dominant narratives about, the compliant, obedient masses. I think that is really a pernicious, problematic narrative that arises out of pessimism and desperation. And I'm
Mhm.
not contesting that there was reason for that. I don't doubt that there was reason for that. At the same time, it is really an unfair characterization of ordinary people and how they behave, how they comport themselves vis-a-vis structures of power. And so I really think that looking at bodily agency allows us to challenge that narrative of total domination by recognizing the eruptions that take place, but which are not always visible politically. They're kind of in the sub-political realm. And only in certain occasions, like in the cases of Bouazizi and a few others, did they become visible and public and global. But that doesn't mean they don't happen. That doesn't mean they're there. And that doesn't mean that they are not subversive. So that's number one. Number two is to really be attentive to the disruptions of the body, the disruptions caused by the body, and the forfeiture of the self as responses to crisis situations, to not just see that, but then see what triggers it, what it is responding to, what it is developing in response to. So the point is not just to say, oh, there is bodily agency, great, but to say, like, what prompts this bodily agency? And to then begin to dig into the conditions of exploitation and oppression that have led people to enact these forms of bodily agency. So to understand where they're coming from, to understand what they're responding to as crisis situations, and to look then at our world, at the operation of global capitalism, at projects of neocolonialism, at projects of imperial domination, as of expressions of this fantasy of total domination, and find the points of friction where it fails, where it meets a kind of refusal from different kinds of people all the time. So I think, and to find that as a new point of commonality, a new form of universal solidarity, and to build out from that. So that's the broader political intention of the project. And in a sense, even though it is dealing with extremely dark and disheartening phenomena, the hope is really something bigger and broader, which is to reimagine, to rethink solidarity, starting out from that corporeal register, and to maintain a kind of hope in the possibility of human dignity expressing itself, even if that expression comes in extremely bleak and disheartening forms, such as existential refusals.
That is really well put. I want to shift into your work around the body anterior. And there's so much in that chapter. And one of the strongest moves, I believe, is your rereading of Marx and Engels as thinkers of bodily suffering. You show exploitation is lived through exhaustion, hunger, deformation, injury, precarity, and wasted life. What becomes visible when Marxism is read from the standpoint of corporeal suffering?
Thank you. That chapter is really close to my heart in the book because it is
Yeah.
also the beginning of my next project. And I'm currently working with Massimiliano Tomba on a new book project around the factory and the question of corporeal suffering in the factory. And what I do, how this work sort of builds out into that is precisely to put the body in the factory at the center of my reading of Marx's Capital, Marx and Engels, but Marx's Capital in particular, and to show how significant it was, a theoretical move, that they brought the body in the factory into visibility. And exploitation not simply as a numerical formula of the extraction of surplus value. Of course, that is there, but what is more interesting and important, and what I think is the incandescent core of their legacy, is that they show us how the factory system upon which capital is built is an existential attack on the life, the ability to breathe, the ability to sleep, the you know, ability to survive of a whole generation and group, almost, of course, degenerated so much physically because of the work that Engels calls them a different species of
Mm.
workers who are reduced to a completely terrible and undignified existence because of their material conditions. And so, but not to read this as a kind of victim story, but to take this as a starting point, which they have taken up as a starting point, and to follow the thread of that and rethink Marxism for the present on the basis of that very corporeal register. Like, exploitation is not some abstract thing that we are all living through. It's not being subjected to the abstract domination of time, or it is really what it takes away from us, from our well-being, from our ability to function and lead a fully human life, from our ability to enjoy one another's presence, from our ability to eat good food, healthy food, from our ability to tend to our children. So there's a whole corporeal dimension of what Marx and Engels' thought enable us to see. And that's what I try to bring out in that chapter. And the new project, that is what I'm working on now, is really running with that idea and hopefully going to bring that to fruition in an interesting way.
Yeah, and you also open a through line between sort of Marx and Foucault around the body as a line of demarcation in modern thought. And if I recall correctly, you note that Foucault returns the body to visibility, but you also resist readings of his work that detach domination from capitalism or production relations. What becomes possible when Marx and Foucault are read together through objectification of the body and the resistance of bodies to power? And why is it important for you to insist on that connection?
Thank you. I mean, I obviously, there are many ways to interpret every thinker, and especially with such complex and nuanced thinkers as Marx and Foucault, there have been as many interpretations as there are readers. But for me, it's important to avoid politically this juxtaposition that I often see in in theoretical interpretations between the Marxist tradition and the Foucauldian tradition as two opposed traditions, and to bring out, a Foucauldian reading as a counterpoint, a better counterpoint than the Marxist. This is a general move that I've seen over and over in theoretical interpretations, especially after the 80s, where Foucault's theory becomes very, very popular and almost hegemonic in at least the Anglophone world, but not only. So I don't deny that Foucault has a complex relationship to the Marxist tradition, and I try to go into that a little bit. But more than that, I see that there are incredible affinities that need to be brought out. Reading these thinkers in alliance with one another is so much more productive to my purposes than reading them at odds with or competing with one another. And I see especially Discipline and Punish by Foucault as a deeply Marxist work, in the sense that uh, you can't really understand discipline unless you look at the factory. And of course, there's the prison, of course, there's the army barracks, but the factory is an incredibly important example of where what Foucault calls disciplinary power is in action. So, building off of that connection, I try to bring what Foucault does for the body in terms of theorizing the powers of the body, its resistance in his works, with Marx's emphasis on what happens to the body at the point of exploitation, and how, if we read them together, what kind of theoretical effects that has for our ability to grasp both the undomesticability of the body on the one hand, but also the various tactics of power that are developed in response to that undomesticability and the desire to domesticate it. So looking at various different situations through a kind of combined sensibility informed both by the insights of the Marxist tradition and the insights of the Foucauldian tradition, especially where they overlap and complement and augment one another, is important to me so that I can then bring that to the analysis of global capitalism today.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to conclude by asking you, in the current moment, when bodily suffering is everywhere visible, but so often reduced to spectacle, humanitarian sentiment, or data, what does disembodiment allow us to understand differently? And does your account of corporeal politics help us read the present beyond the usual languages of victimhood, resilience, or crisis?
Thank you for that question. I would say that, let me answer that both philosophically and politically. Philosophically speaking, the project is, in its broad conception, very much influenced by Adorno's negative dialectics. And Adorno, arguing against any kind of identitarian thinking, always urges us to pay attention to what falls out of the concept. What is the remainder that is not quite abstracted into the concept when you're looking at how the concept refers to a certain reality. And he notes that the body and bodily suffering is a kind of remainder that doesn't easily get subsumed by its own concept. There is something very material, very universal, very uneliminable about bodily suffering that no concept, however capacious, can really completely grasp it. So, philosophically speaking, then, my project is about taking that remainder, that non identical remainder, as a starting point, and to sort of pull that thread to see how the world of total domination tends to unravel, and really to use that juxtaposition as a way of analyzing domination and its limitations, and to build off of those limitations. And politically, as you said, I mean, to connect the two for the kind of critical theory approach, this is what a materialist approach, as opposed to idealist political philosophy, should do, both normatively but also methodologically. And so, building off of that, I hope that the book makes a political intervention that shifts a little bit these narratives of passivity and victimhood, and that tend us to look at our agency in a very different way, and to start from the point of the body as an alternative building block of political agency, of collective solidarity, of alternative forms of globality that connect us to different experiences around the world, in which people respond to the crises that they face on a daily basis with dignity, with refusal, with agency. And I think building off of that may allow us to be a little bit more hopeful about the future.
Thank you, Banu, for joining me today here on Organic Filaments Network. Any final words? Again, thank you for taking out the time. I know you're busy.
Thank you so much. No, thank you for your excellent questions. I hope I was able to convey the project, different facets of the project a little bit. And I'm really thankful for the opportunity to talk with you and to reach your audience through you. So thank you.
This was a rich and challenging conversation on disembodiment, on bodily suffering, dignity, hunger strike, and the forms of political thought that that become possible once the body can no longer be treated as secondary to politics, but has to be confronted as one of its central terrains. That was our conversation with Banu Bargu. If you found this meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the work, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.